Chapter 13 of Jacob's Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tina Isaacs, Kuala Lumpur, www.tina-isaacs.com. Jacob's Room by Virginia Woolf, Chapter 13. The height of the season, said Bonamy. The sun had already blistered the paint on the backs of the green chairs in Hyde Park, peeled the bark off the plane trees, and turned the earth to powder and to smooth yellow pebbles. Hyde Park was circled incessantly by turning wheels. The height of the season, said Bonamy sarcastically. He was sarcastic because of Clara Durrant, because Jacob had come back from Greece very brown and lean, with his pockets full of Greek notes which he pulled out when the chairman came for pence, because Jacob was silent. He has not said a word to show that he is glad to see me, thought Bonamy busily. The motor cars passed incessantly over the bridge of the Serpentine. The upper class walked upright or bent themselves gracefully over the palings. The lower classes lay with their knees cocked up, flat on their backs. The sheep grazed on pointed wooden legs. Small children ran down the sloping grass, stretched their arms and fell. Very urbane, Jacob brought out. Urbane, on the lips of Jacob, had mysteriously all the shapeliness of a character which Bonamy thought daily more sublime, devastating, terrific than ever, though he was still, and perhaps would be forever, barbaric, obscure. What superlatives! What adjectives! How acquit Bonamy of sentimentality of the grossest sort, of being tossed like a cork on the waves, of having no steady insight into character, of being unsupported by reason, and of drawing no comfort whatever from the works of the classics? The height of civilization, said Jacob. He was fond of using Latin words. Magnanimity, virtue, such words, when Jacob used them in talk with Bonamy, meant that he took control of the situation, that Bonamy would play round him like an affectionate spaniel, and that, as likely as not, they would end rolling on the floor. And Greece, said Bonamy, the Parthenon and all that? There's none of this European mysticism, said Jacob. It's the atmosphere, I suppose, said Bonamy. And you went to Constantinople? Yes, said Jacob. Bonamy paused, moved a pebble, then darted in with the rapidity and certainty of a lizard's tongue. You are in love, he exclaimed. Jacob blushed. The sharpest of knives never cut so deep. As for responding, or taking the least account of it, Jacob stared straight ahead of him, fixed, monolithic, oh, very beautiful. Like a British admiral, exclaimed Bonamy in a rage, rising from his seat and walking off, waiting for some sound. None came, too proud to look back, walking quicker and quicker until he found himself gazing into motor cars and cursing women. Where was the pretty woman's face? Clara's, Fanny's, Florinda's? Who was the pretty little creature? Not Clara Durrant. The Aberdeen terrier must be exercised, and as Mr. Bowley was going that very moment, would like nothing better than a walk, they went together, Clara and kind little Bowley. Bowley, who had rooms in the Albany. Bowley, who wrote letters to the Times in a jocular vein about foreign hotels and the aurora borealis. Bowley, who liked young people and walked down Piccadilly with his right arm resting on the boss of his back. Little demon, cried Clara, and attached Troy to his chain. Bowley anticipated, hoped for, a confidence. Devoted to her mother, Clara sometimes felt her a little, well, her mother was so sure of herself that she could not understand other people being as ludicrous as I am, Clara jerked out, the dog tugging her forwards. And Bowley thought she looked like a huntress, and turned over in his mind which it should be, some pale virgin with a slip of the moon in her hair, which was a flight for Bowley. The colour was in her cheeks, to have spoken outright about her mother. Still, it was only to Mr. Bowley, who loved her as everybody must. But to speak was unnatural to her. Yet it was awful to feel, as she had done all day, that she must tell someone. "Wait till we cross the road," she said to the dog, bending down. Happily she recovered by that time. "She thinks so much about England," she said. "She is so anxious." Bowley was defrauded, as usual. Clara never confided in anyone. "Why don't the young people settle it, eh?" he wanted to ask. "What's all this about England?" A question poor Clara could not have answered, since, as Mrs Durrant discussed with Sir Edgar the policy of Sir Edward Grey, Clara only wondered why the cabinet looked dusty, and Jacob had never come. Oh, here was Mrs Cowley Johnson. And Clara would hand the pretty china teacups and smile at the compliment that no one in London made tea so well as she did. "We get it at Brocklebank's," she said, "in Cursitor Street." Ought she not to be grateful? Ought she not to be happy? Especially since her mother looked so well and enjoyed so much talking to Sir Edgar about Morocco, Venezuela, or some such place. Jacob, Jacob, thought Clara. And kind Mr Bowley, who was ever so good with old ladies, looked, stopped, wondered whether Elizabeth wasn't too harsh with her daughter, wondered about Bonamy, Jacob, which young fellow was it? And jumped up directly Clara said she must exercise Troy. They had reached the site of the old exhibition. They looked at the tulips. Stiff and curled, the little rods of waxy smoothness rose from the earth, nourished yet contained, suffused with scarlet and coral pink. Each had its shadow. Each grew trimly in the diamond-shaped wedge as the gardener had planned it. "Barnes never gets them to grow like that," Clara mused. She sighed. "You are neglecting your friends," said Bowley, as someone, going the other way, lifted his hat. She started, acknowledged Mr Lionel Parry's bow. Wasted on him what had sprung for Jacob. Jacob, Jacob, she thought. "But you'll get run over if I let you go," she said to the dog. "England seems all right," said Mr Bowley. The loop of the railing behind the statue of Achilles was full of parasols and waistcoats, chains and bangles, of ladies and gentlemen lounging elegantly, lightly observant. "This statue was erected by the women of England," Clara read out with a foolish little laugh. "Oh, Mr Bowley, oh!" Gallop, gallop, gallop. A horse galloped past without a rider. The stirrups swung, the pebbles spurted. "Oh, stop, stop it, Mr Bowley!" she cried, white, trembling, gripping his arm, utterly unconscious, the tears coming. "Tut, tut," said Mr Bowley in his dressing-room an hour later. "Tut, tut," a comment that was profound enough, though inarticulately expressed, since his valet was handing his shirt-studs. Julia Elliot, too, had seen the horse run away, and had risen from her seat to watch the end of the incident, which, since she came of a sporting family, seemed to her slightly ridiculous. Sure enough, the little man came pounding behind with his breeches dusty, looked thoroughly annoyed, and was being helped to mount by a policeman when Julia Elliot, with a sardonic smile, turned towards the Marble Arch on her errand of mercy. It was only to visit a sick old lady who had known her mother, and perhaps the Duke of Wellington, for Julia shared the love of her sex for the distressed, liked to visit deathbeds, threw slippers at weddings, received confidences by the dozen, knew more pedigrees than a scholar knows dates, and was one of the kindliest, most generous, least continent of women. Yet 5 minutes after she had passed the statue of Achilles, she had the rapt look of one brushing through crowds on a summer's afternoon, when the trees were rustling, the wheels churning yellow, and the tumult of the present seemed like an elegy for the past youth and past summers. And there rose in her mind a curious sadness, as if time and eternity showed through skirts and waistcoats, and she saw people passing tragically to destruction. Yet heaven knows, Julia was no fool. A sharper woman at a bargain did not exist. She was always punctual. The watch on her wrist gave her 12 minutes and a half in which to reach Bruton Street. Lady Congreve expected her at 5. The gilt clock at Verrey's was striking 5. Florinda looked at it with a dull expression, like an animal. She looked at the clock, looked at the door, looked at the long glass opposite, disposed her cloak, drew closer to the table, for she was pregnant. No doubt about it, Mother Stuart said, recommending remedies, consulting friends, sunk, caught by the heel, as she tripped so lightly over the surface. Her tumbler of pinkish sweet stuff was set down by the waiter, and she sucked through a straw, her eyes on the looking-glass, on the door, now soothed by the sweet taste. When Nick Branham came in, it was plain, even to the young Swiss waiter, that there was a bargain between them. Nick hitched his clothes together clumsily, ran his fingers through his hair, sat down to an ordeal nervously. She looked at him, and set off laughing, laughed. The young Swiss waiter, standing with crossed legs by the pillar, laughed too. The door opened. In came the roar of Regent Street, the roar of traffic, impersonal, unpitying, and sunshine grained with dirt. The Swiss waiter must see to the customers. Branham lifted his glass. "He's like Jacob," said Florinda, looking at the newcomer. "The way he stares." She stopped laughing. Jacob leaned forward, drew a plan of the Parthenon in the dust in Hyde Park, a network of strokes at least, which may have been the Parthenon or again a mathematical diagram. And why was the pebble so emphatically ground at the corner? It was not to count his notes as he took out a wad of papers and read a long flowing letter which Sandra had written 2 days ago at the Milton Dower house, with his book before her and her mind a memory of something said or attempted, some moment in the dark on the road to Acropolis which, such was her creed, mattered forever. "He is," she mused, "like the man in Molière." She meant Alceste. She meant he was severe. She meant that she could deceive him. Or could I not? She thought, putting the poems of Donne back in the bookcase. "Jacob," she went on, going to the window and looking over the spotted flower beds across the grass where the piebald cows grazed under the beech trees. Jacob would be shocked. The perambulator was going through the little gate in the railing. She kissed her hand. Directed by the nurse, Jimmy waved his. "He's a small boy," she said, thinking of Jacob. "And yet, Alceste?" "What a nuisance you are," Jacob grumbled, stretching out first one leg and then the other, and feeling in each trouser pocket for his chair ticket. "I expect the sheep have eaten it," he said. "Why do you keep sheep?" "Sorry to disturb you, sir," said the ticket collector, his hand deep in the enormous pouch of pence. "Well, I hope they pay you for it," said Jacob. "There you are. No, you can stick to it. Go and get drunk." He had parted with half a crown, tolerantly, compassionately, with considerable contempt for his species. Even now poor Fanny Elmer was dealing, as she walked along the Strand, in her incompetent way with this very careless, indifferent, sublime manner he had of talking to railway guards or porters, or Mrs. Whitehorn when she consulted him about her little boy who was beaten by the schoolmaster. Sustained entirely upon picture postcards for the past 2 months, Fanny's idea of Jacob was more statuesque, noble, and eyeless than ever. To reinforce her vision, she had taken to visiting the British Museum, where, keeping her eyes downcast until she was alongside of the battered Ulysses, she opened them and got a fresh stock of Jacob's presents, enough to last her half a day. But this was wearing thin, and she wrote now, poems, letters that were never posted, saw his face in advertisements on hoardings, and would cross the road to let the barrel organ turn her musings to rhapsody. But at breakfast she shared rooms with the teacher. When the butter was smeared across the plate, and the prongs of the forks were clotted with old egg yolk, she revised these visions violently, was, in truth, very cross, was losing her complexion, as Marjorie Jackson told her, bringing the whole thing down, as she laced her stout boots, to a level of mother-wit, vulgarity, and sentiment, for she had loved too, and been a fool. "One's godmothers ought to have told me," said Fanny, looking in at the window of Bacon, the map-seller, in the Strand. "Told one that it is no use making a fuss. This is life, they should have said, as Fanny said it now, looking at the large yellow globe marked with steamship lines. This is life, said Fanny. "A very hard face," thought Miss Barrett, on the other side of the glass, buying maps of the Syrian desert and waiting impatiently to be served. "Girls look old so soon nowadays." The equator swam behind tears. "Piccadilly?" Fanny asked the conductor of the omnibus. "Step to the top." After all, he must come back to her. But Jacob must have been thinking of Rome, of architecture, of jurisprudence, as he sat under the plane trees in Hyde Park. The omnibus stopped outside Charing Cross, and behind it were clogged omnibuses, vans, motor cars, for a procession with banners was passing down Whitehall, and elderly people were stiffly descending from between the paws of the slippery lions, where they had been testifying to their faith, singing lustily, raising their eyes from their music to look into the sky, and still their eyes were on the sky as they marched behind the gold letters of their creed. Traffic stopped, and the sun, no longer sprayed out by the breeze, became almost too hot. But the procession passed, the banners glittered. Far away down Whitehall, the traffic was released, lurched on, spun to a smooth, continuous uproar, swerving round the curve of Cockspur Street, and sweeping past government offices and equestrian statues down Whitehall to the prickly spires, the tethered grey fleet of masonry, and the large white clock of Westminster. 5 strokes, Big Ben intoned. Nelson received the salute. The wires of the Admiralty shivered with some far-away communication. A voice kept remarking that Prime Ministers and Viceroys spoke in the Reichstag, entered Lahore, said that the Emperor travelled, in Milan they rioted, said that there were rumours in Vienna, said that the ambassador at Constantinople had audience with the Sultan. The fleet were at Gibraltar. The voice continued, imprinting on the faces of the clerks in Whitehall. Timothy Durrant was one of them. Something of its own inexorable gravity as they listened, deciphered, wrote down. Papers accumulated, inscribed with the utterances of Kaisers, the statistics of rice fields, the growing of hundreds of workpeople, plotting sedition in back streets, or gathering in the Calcutta bazaars, or mustering their forces in the uplands of Albania, where the hills are sand-coloured and bones lie unburied. The voice spoke plainly in the square quiet room with heavy tables, where one elderly man made notes on the margin of typewritten sheets, his silver-topped umbrella leaning against the bookcase. His head, bald, red-veined, hollow-looking, represented all the heads in the building. His head, with the amiable pale eyes, carried the burden of knowledge across the street, laid it before his colleagues, who came equally burdened, and then the 16 gentlemen, lifting their pens or turning perhaps rather wearily in their chairs, decreed that the course of history would shape itself this way or that way, being manfully determined, as their faces showed, to impose some coherency upon Rajas and Kaisers and the mutterings in bazaars, the secret gatherings, plainly visible in Whitehall, of kilted peasants in Albanian uplands, to control the course of events. Pitt and Chatham, Burke and Gladstone looked from side to side with fixed marble eyes and an air of immortal quiescence which perhaps the living may have envied, the air being full of whistling and concussions, as the processions with its banners passed down Whitehall. Moreover, some were troubled with dyspepsia. One had at that very moment cracked the glass of his spectacles. Another spoke in Glasgow tomorrow. Altogether, they looked too red, flat, pale, or lean to be dealing, as the marble heads had dealt, with the course of history. Timothy Durrant, in his little room in the Admiralty, going to consult a blue book, stopped for a moment by the window and observed the placard tied around the lamp-post. Miss Thomas, one of the typists, said to a friend that if the cabinet was going to sit much longer, she should miss her boy outside the Gaiety. Timmy Durrant, returning with his blue book under his arm, noticed a little knot of people at the street corner, conglomerated as though one of them knew something, and the others, pressing round him, looked up, looked down, looked along the street. What was it that he knew? Timothy, placing the blue book before him, studied a paper sent round by the Treasury for information. Mr. Crawley, his fellow clerk, impaled the letter on a skewer. Jacob rose from his chair in Hyde Park, tore his ticket to pieces, and walked away. "Such a sunset," wrote Mrs. Flanders in her letter to Archer at Singapore. "One couldn't make up one's mind to come indoors," she wrote. It seemed wicked to waste even a moment. The long windows of Kensington Palace flushed fiery rose as Jacob walked away. A flock of wild duck flew over the Serpentine, and the trees were stood against the sky, blackly, magnificently. "Jacob," wrote Mrs. Flanders, with the red light on her page, "is hard at work over his delightful journey." "The Kaiser," a faraway voice remarked in Whitehall, "received me in audience." "Now I know that face," said Reverend Andrew Floyd, coming out of Carter's shop in Piccadilly, "but who the dickens—" And he watched Jacob, turned around to look at him, but could not be sure. "Oh, Jacob Flanders!" he remembered in a flash. But he was so tall, so unconscious, such a fine young fellow. "I gave him Byron's works," Andrew Floyd mused, and started forward as Jacob crossed the road, but hesitated and let the moment pass, and lost the opportunity. Another procession without banners was blocking Long Acre. Carriages with dowagers in amethyst and gentlemen spotted with carnations intercepted cabs and motor cars turned in the opposite direction, in which jaded men in white waistcoats lolled, on their way home to shrubberies and billiards rooms in Putney and Wimbledon. Two-barrelled organs played by the curb, and horses coming out of Aldridge with white lapels on their buttocks straddled across the road and were smartly jerked back. Mrs. Durrant, sitting with Mr. Whatley in a motor car, was impatient lest they miss the overture. But Mr. Whatley, always urbane, always in time for that overture, buttoned his gloves and admired Miss Clara. "A shame to spend such a night in the theatre," said Mrs. Durrant, seeing all the windows of the coachmakers in Long Acre ablaze. "Think of your Moors," said Mrs. Worsley to Clara. "Ah, but Clara likes this better," Mrs. Durrant laughed. "I don't really," said Clara, looking at the blazing windows. She started. She saw Jacob. "Who?" asked Mrs. Durrant sharply, leaning forward. But she saw no one. Under the arch of the opera house, large faces and lean ones, the powdered and the hairy, all alike were red in the sunset, and quickened by the great hanging lamps with their repressed primrose lights, by the tramp, and the scarlet, and the pompous ceremony. Some ladies looked for a moment into steaming bedrooms near by, where women with loose hair leaned out of windows, where girls, well, children, the long mirrors held the ladies suspended. But one must follow, one must not block the way. Clara's Moors were fine enough. The Phoenicians slept with their piled grey rocks. The chimneys of old mines pointed starkly. Early moths blurred the heather bells. Cartwheels could be heard grinding on the road far beneath, and the suck and sighing of the waves sounded gently, persistently, forever. Shading her eyes with her hand, Mrs. Pascoe stood in her cabbage garden looking out to sea. Two steamers and a sailing ship crossed each other, passed each other, and in the bay the gulls kept alighting on a log, rising high and returning again to the log, while some rode in upon the waves and stood on the rim of the water, until the moon blanched all to whiteness. Mrs. Pascoe had gone indoors long ago. But the red light was on the columns of the Parthenon, and the Greek women who were knitting their stockings, and sometimes crying to a child to come and have the insects picked from its head, were as jolly as sand martins in the heat, quarrelling, scolding, suckling their babies, until the ships in the Piraeus fired their guns. The sound spread itself flat, and went tunnelling its way with fitful explosions along the channels of the islands. Darkness drops like a knife over Greece. "The guns?" said Betty Flanders, half asleep, getting out of bed and going to the window, which was decorated with a fringe of dark leaves. "Not at this distance," she thought. "It is the sea." Again, far away, she heard a dull sound, as if nocturnal women were beating great carpets. There was Morty lost and Seabrook dead, her sons fighting for their country. But were the chickens safe? Was that someone moving downstairs? Rebecca with a toothache? No. The nocturnal women were beating great carpets. Her hands shifted slightly on their perches. End of chapter 13. Recording by Tina Isaacs. Kuala Lumpur. www.tina-isaacs.com